My name is Zorian Clayton, and I'd like to welcome Jackie, who's going to be doing BSL interpretation today. I'm a Prince curator here and the co-chair of the LGBTQ working group, so I've just been asked to explain what that group is very quickly before we start. We've been running since about 2006. The main stalwart thing was doing History Month every year, but we've grown and expanded to do things all year round. We do lots of collaborations with other organisations, Being Human Festival, British Academy today, and the Society for Dance Research. And we have the monthly volunteer tours, and there's one after this. It's Saturday, 4 p.m, the last Saturday of every month, as always, an LGBTQ free tour. So we're delighted to have be collaborating today with the British Academy and the Society for Dance Research. So over the next 2 hours, we're going to explore the LGBTQ club scene in London and beyond. To set the scene, we're going to start with a performance before moving into a panel discussion and ending with a DJ set where you will be encouraged to come up onto the stage and dance. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our opening dancers. We have Hannah Milan and Bam Bam 007. So they wanted me to say that they would like to recognise the contributions of the icons Yolanda and Cassandra, who pioneered this genre. So please, big round of applause for Hannah Milan and Bam Bam 007.
name is Flora Pitrolo, and thank you very much for coming here. I'm going to be chairing our discussion today, which will last approximately 1 hour. I'll steer a conversation with the panelists, who I'm about to introduce, and then we'll also take some questions from the audience. Our discussion today aims to explore the dance floor as a utopian space where people come together to express their identities and desires. With over 50% of London venues closing over the last 10 years, there has been much concern from within and beyond the LGBTQ community about the death of the dance floor and the closure of safe and enjoyable nightlife spaces. So what we'll be doing this afternoon is we'll be asking our panelists to reflect on the current climate and to discuss what more needs to be done to reinvent the scene in London and beyond for everyone on the LGBTQ spectrum. Let me introduce our panelists. We have Ben Campkin, Professor of History and Theory of Architecture and Urbanism at UCL. Thank you very much. Fenella Hitchcock, who is Associate Lecturer in Cultural and Historical Studies at London College of Fashion. And Ramón Rivera-Servera, Chair of the Department of Performance Studies at Northwestern University. Please join me in. Okay, so thank you very much for being here, and let's start big. What is utopian about the queer dance floor?
Okay, well, I'm happy to start off with that one. It's an intriguing question. I think the way that it was framed in the advertising for the session, it was the LGBTQ dance floor, which I think is kind of interesting because I'm not sure how many LGBTQ dance floors there are in London, but thinking about that made me reflect on the need to think about the dance floors historically when we're addressing this question, and ask how the dance floors served specific groups at specific moments of time. And I was thinking, particularly because we're in Kensington, of the Gay Liberation Front in the 1970s, who overtook Kensington Town Hall in 1970 as one of their quite radical acts of appropriation of space, and turned that into their dance floor. They had their first ball there. And obviously that was linked to a very obvious, directly utopian politics, which is about sexual liberation, about addressing the gender politics of the time, and also, I think, importantly, critiquing the scenes that were available to people at that time. So, critiquing the commercial pubs and so on, which were quite hostile and often working with the police in ways that the activists were trying to draw attention to. And then I was also thinking about the dance floor as a design space, and the second example that I would give would be in the 1980s and the 1990s, the London Lesbian and Gay Centre, where there was suddenly this opportunity, ironically with money from the Thatcher government, to design a community space which had a dance floor in it. And again, that was a radical space. It was a place where activism happened, where performance happened, where art production happened, where people partied, where people got intoxicated, where people had actual fist fights. It wasn't an easy space to negotiate in terms of the inclusivity of that dance floor. But it was certainly a utopian space, and it was a space that often provided opportunities for people who were marginalised within the LGBT groups to occupy that space and meet each other and work politically to imagine better futures, which I think is what being utopian is about. So I'd say that in both of those moments, there's this utopian imagining of a future world, but there's also an engagement with the flawed world of the present, which is very direct.
I really appreciate your commentary, Ben, in the sense that, oftentimes we think about utopia as somewhere out there, somewhere elsewhere, and a time of the future, right? And what you articulated well aligns with where most of the thinking in queer studies and in the work of performance studies specifically has advanced in terms of thinking about queer utopia as not a then there, but a here now. right? And as a practice that in the effort, in the corporeal efforts of dancing in a public space, for example, we transform a space into the dance floor, right? And it was, you know, and to think about those categories in terms of the kind of social activation that unravels based on the very techniques of practicing performance or dance or fashion or whatever it is that we cultivate as an exercise of being queer in the world. You know, and the example of the opening dance just today, the first few minutes started making me a little bit nervous. The Victoria and Albert Museum, it's my first time here, and we're in this audience, and it's starting to look like a spectator sport, and I was like, please start clapping, please start clapping, please start keeping that rhythm, because ultimately that is also something that is quite particular about what is utopian about this exercise, specific to the dance floor, is that it requires a broader social activation than the performer alone, right? And that it requires that signing on to the participatory framework of, you know, even if it's contestatory, sometimes, you know, I could be dancing in the dance floor to inspire your rejection, or to reject you rather publicly in my own imaginary catwalk, right? So attitudes are meant to be multi-directional, but they're meant to be interactive, right? And I think that idea, that utopia that we construct, is not an evasion of the restrictions and repressions that may make life difficult, but actually an active confrontation and wrestling with them, and an insistence on what the beauty of our techniques of becoming as queers in the dance floor bring forth as a way of instantiating a different moment and a different way of being now, not far.
I think so much of what you said connects to the relationship between fashion and nightlife and fashion and the dance floor. Obviously, I am here to talk about fashion. And what I love about nightlife is that so much discussion that we have about fashion is about the things that are negative about it, like shitty labour practices, sustainability. But the utopian aspects of the dance floor are kind of where we act out desire, we act out yearning, we act out sex, you know, and all of these things about kind of dreaming come through the way that we style our bodies, the way that we adorn ourselves, and that's integral to how participants in these spaces create utopia and also produce queerness in those spaces. I also think that these dress practices are really important in terms of how they create kinship and how they're a form of collectivity. So that kind of affirmation, the fact that you're doing that for a queer audience and you're not doing it for, you know, the validation of outside groups. I mean, I'm also really interested in the kind of the hopefulness and the feeling of these spaces as well. Clubs make me get really deep in my feelings, and I'm particularly interested in performance studies work that looks at kind of hope as a form of political affect, and how this kind of hopeful feeling that we get, it isn't just about this kind of transient kind of one moment thing that's quite superficial and like, yes, I love your look, great, but how that hope can actually be used going forward to create kind of more meaningful change. So yes, we create the utopia in the moment, but also it's a force for creating positive change and moving towards that in some way, outside of those spaces, beyond that one night, beyond an after party.
Brilliant, yeah, absolutely. I guess from what you just said there about hope, I suppose as a follow-on question, I would ask, why does LGBTQ nightlife matter? And perhaps, maybe, why does it specifically matter now, if you feel it does specifically matter now? Go ahead, Ben, as you wish.
I mean, I think the research that we've done at UCL in the Urban Lab, where we asked people why LGBT nightlife spaces matter, came back very strongly with a set of reasons which were to do with sort of personal stories of arriving in a city and needing to connect with other people within a community, but also people wanting a sense of identity formed through relationship to space, but also relationship to the past. And I think that's what's come out quite strongly in the recent closures of venues, that actually people have recognised that those spaces have embedded within them particular histories of social struggles and social movements in response to those struggles, so histories of utopianism. And yeah, so I mean, there are a sort of wide range of practical reasons why those spaces matter. I mean, if you answer that question from a city authority's point of view, it's probably more to do with the business case for nightlife mattering and the nighttime economy.
Yeah, well.
But if you ask the communities themselves, then I think the answers are to do with social health and well-being.
I think Fenella nailed it, and
Yeah.
when she was talking about, that they're laboratories for figuring out how the world can be otherwise, right? And your example with fashion and articulating. Sure. So there's no problem. So there are laboratories for imagining how the world could be otherwise, right? And in that sense, she talks about it in the context of fashion and how that appreciation harbors this affectivities of hope and so on. And I'm here thinking about Jose Esteban Munoz and Jill Dolan and other scholars who have really mined the potentiality of that feeling, of that affective register of the communal. And from the dance studies perspective, it's also a way in which we rehearse a different corporality, a different way of walking into the world, of assuming posture, of relating to other bodies around us that manifests in the kinds of ways we express beyond that space. And in that sense, you're absolutely right. We carry the club with us. We carry nightlife with us across other coordinates of time and space. And those kinds of intimacies that we rehearse with a bit more abandon and intentionality in the context of the club or the dance floor starts to habituate ourselves to a different kind of sociality beyond that space. I'm from Puerto Rico, and I'm a queer Puerto Rican in the world after the Pulse Massacre, right? And accounting for the ways in which those major traumatic events still get carried with us and the way in which we continue to rehearse the possibilities of still congregating and practicing, being with each other, being touchy, being rhythmical, being out of rhythm, or whatever it might be we want to do in the context of that platform. Our insistence on it is because it's life-giving. I know many people, including myself, who are alive because they found a space like the Queer Club, where they could both gain validation, but also techniques of continuing to sustain life.
I would add to that they're really important because queer nightlife spaces give you access to different forms or different articulations of masculinity, femininity, or something completely other that you don't have access to perhaps in your daily life, and how important that is in kind of understanding yourself as an individual and also socially in relation to others. I also think it's important not to play down the fact that this just produces joy, it's pleasurable, it's about being creative, and these are all really, really important things. You mentioned corporeality, so fashion in particular, it's about getting in touch with your body in a way that's incredibly important to queer people, really affirming. Research that I do is increasingly focused on fashion practices rather than aesthetics that come out of nightlife. So I'm finishing, it should be finished, a journal article with my lovely colleague and actually more importantly friend, Jane Macaulay-Bostad, which is about how Charles Jeffrey's fashion practices are inherently informed by coming out of scenes at VFD in East London, and how the work is presented, how the work is made, who gets to work on things, is all informed by nightlife more broadly. And Charles is really interesting because his last collection explicitly thought about this idea of queer utopia. And there are incredibly beautiful show notes that went with it, which were all about kind of looking after those that are smaller than us, speaking for those who are not able to do that. And, that's why it matters, really.
Yeah. Brilliant. Yes. Life affirming. Okay. So, into darker territory now. We've already mentioned the shocking statistic that over 50% of London's LGBTQ venues have closed in the last 10 years. Ben, you are the lead on the UCL Race Collective and Queer Spaces Network research project LGBTQI Nightlife Spaces in London, which received funding from the Mayor of London. What did your findings tell you about why these spaces have been closing?
Well, so just to follow up on the last comments that were made, I think it's also important, and it certainly came out in our research, that, and perhaps what we're talking about is a kind of ideal queer dance floor club, but actually lots of clubs are not queer in that literal sense of being, you know, anti-heteronormative or anti-homonormative or anti-capitalist, etc. So certainly we found a great diversity in our research. So I wouldn't want to sort of romanticize the queer dance floor, because there a lot of issues came out in our research around, you know, transphobia, misogyny, classism, you know, just how much do you have to pay to get in. So we're talking about spaces that are often very exclusive, inherently so. But in terms of why they're closing, the research that we did showed that the Mayor gave some funding towards the project and wanted us to look only at the past 10 years and only at licensed venues. So actually we excluded a lot of the dance floors that might be the more interesting and queer ones. We didn't exclude them because we carried on looking at them, but from the Mayor's point of view, we only looked at licensed premises, which gives you a kind of distorted view. But we found that there were 158 in 2006 and only 51 by 2017. But actually the number of events has carried on rising during that period. So there's something about barriers to people actually being able to run those spaces, and spaces closing for a whole range of reasons, but some of the things that we noticed in particular were the relationship between closures and large-scale transport infrastructure development. So if you look at Crossrail 2, the big east-to-west train line that's being built, and Tottenham Court Road Station, you'll notice that a whole series, a kind of mini cluster of venues closed in relationship to that. Now some of those venues have been there for a long time. Some of them knew it was precarious when they moved in, but there were some of the more radical places like First Out, the cafe bar that used to be there, which did have a dance floor at times, kind of improvised. Anyway, so what we partly noticed was this relationship to large-scale infrastructure, the same story in King's Cross, and it's the same story with lots of different cultural spaces, not just dance floor spaces. But we also noticed that historically important boroughs like Kensington and Chelsea had seen great drops in numbers of spaces during that period of the last 10 years. Camden would be another one. And Kensington and Chelsea was quite an important cluster in the 1970s and 80s. And we often also noticed that the people that were operating the spaces were not the owners, and were therefore precarious, and if there was some form of residential development or other form of development, then it was easy to get rid of them, and there were often rent spikes and ways that you could get rid of people from those properties quite easily. And of course behind all of these properties in central London there's larger landowners and so on. So often there's this kind of asymmetry between the people that are running the spaces and the institutions behind them that are exchanging them for their commodity value.
I wanted to second your observation around our kind of assumptions on idealization of queer space, and think about it in terms of the kinds of shifts from, you know, and proliferation of events over established spaces, especially from the perspective, my area of focus is mostly queer color folks that don't usually work under traditional frameworks of capitalizing and licensing major nightlife venues. And there has been a shift even in established venues, like homonormative platforms, commercial platforms, into queer spaces that have really favored the kind of itinerant platform, the event-based platform, mostly out of queer nightlife artists trying to own and control their own platforms more substantively, because we often have a way of conflating the space with the creative practice that happens therein, and there's oftentimes long histories of confrontational relationships between club ownerships and club practitioners and club patrons, right? And that affects quite specifically queer of color, working class practitioners working within increasingly commercializing pink districts at most major urban environments as well.
I mean, I feel like I should respond in reference to romanticism. I think my view on it is very romantic, and I should clarify that my research looks at those spaces in particular. I mean, when you were talking about kind of the issues that come with exclusion that happens, it is an issue. I mean, I used to work doors, and you have a job as a door bitch to do a little bit of positive discrimination, right? You're about kind of regulating those spaces, keeping people safe. And also, like earlier when we were talking about things not becoming a spectator event, like you have to kind of work out, are you going to join in? Because from my perspective, I'm not letting you in if you're not going to join in. This is not a spectator sport. And I will wreck your outfit if I don't think it's up to snuff, which I have done, rightly or wrongly. But also, when you were talking about kind of transphobia that can happen, these are all really significant issues that shouldn't be ignored. But what I would like to highlight is spaces like VFD, which I'm really lucky that that's my local bar. If you look at the work that people like Kat and Phoebe have done for Femtopia about getting a space that is supportive to femmes, if you look at the amazing Lucia, who runs the weekly meetup Transmissions, who is centred upon getting gender non-conforming and trans people together to meet, to socialise. It isn't just about having a dance party, although sometimes it does involve that. It's about kind of public speakers, it's about activism. They just staged an amazing protest as part of Fashion Week that's thinking about trans inclusion. So I agree with you in part, but I think my research tends to focus on the stuff that I feel is positive and that is forward-thinking, because otherwise, for me, it becomes incredibly depressing. It doesn't make me want to do the work anymore.
We just need more of those spaces.
Yeah, more of those.
I think we're getting them as well, and I think that's partly come out of all of this discussion around spaces closing. So it's another moment of finding this flaw in the system. The market wasn't working for these spaces, and there was this big negative discussion, and I think from that there has been an increase in more positive and more actively inclusive spaces. So it's quite similar to the GLF responding to those problems we were seeing at the time, and also with the same way that they set up the London Lesbian and Gay Centre as a kind of anti-scene or reaction to the scene.
Mm-hmm. Then, in your research, you also found the venues that cater for women and Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, LGBTQ people are at much higher risk. So I guess this ties in very clearly to the discussion that we've just been having. Can you pinpoint particular reasons behind that happening? And is there anything to be hopeful about as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you need to think intersectionally about who has access to these spaces in the first place. So there were fewer spaces for, fewer women's spaces to start with, and fewer queer people of colour spaces. And certainly when we looked at licensed venues, I think there's one currently operated by a person of colour, and so I think that there are fewer spaces in the first place. And actually, if you speak to QTPOC promoters and so on, they talk about the experiences of taking over straight venues or host venues, and the kind of barriers that they come up against within those processes. So I think that it's certainly that is how we should be thinking in utopian ways about making future spaces, as who within the communities has fewer spaces in the first place, and how can you make those communities more secure. So I think rather than a kind of completely future-looking utopianism or a complete focus on the present, I think we have to think about this historically as well, and why particular communities have been excluded historically, and how they could have better access. So, I mean, disability is another key issue.
Absolutely.
I mean, many of the dance floors that we looked at were underground without access, because they're in infrastructure spaces that queer communities took over, because those were the spaces that were easy to appropriate.
Yeah, and in fact, as a more general question, I just wanted to ask you how you think the scene can become more inclusive, in what ways? I don't know if that's what that's.
No, I think
you're
it
about to-
aligns certainly with that way of thinking about things. You know, I keep thinking, oftentimes when we think about the viability of the club space, especially queer space specifically, we tend to think within the doors of the club, and we forget about the broader ecologies that animate queer nightlife, especially for working class, queer color folks. And you know, the work, I'm thinking of work of folks like Kemi Adeyemi, who's been working at Black women's queer nightlife in a city like Chicago, and how they navigate quickly gentrifying spaces and so on. And realizing that what Lucas Messer, who's a scholar in Arizona, once called peri-performance spaces, peri-club spaces, which are everything that surrounds and sustains the nightlife ecology. The alleyways, the make-out alleyways, the safety routes from public transportation to doorways into the club, the livability of neighborhoods for working class and folks of color to live in proximity to these routes are crucial to the long-time sustainability of a queer space. If you are going to have the wildest, most queer space in a completely sterile environment surrounding it, you're not going to have much of a queer nightlife. So it's thinking more broadly about what makes a queer club a destination for much more than the time period of that event, of that culture. And especially because we know, in thinking queerly about these spaces, that we carry and we sustain these practices well beyond our time together within the restrictions of a DJ set, right? And that in order to have sustainable queer nightlife, we need to have sustainable lives. And and part of that in cities like Chicago and New York, for example, the biggest problem is that the shifting political economy of the city is just pushing creative queers of color out of the neighborhood, period. And once your commute becomes 2 hours, you're not going to come to Lower Manhattan just to go party. Or you're not going to come down to the center of Chicago just to have a good night. Because you have to work, you have to do everything else that you have to do. So the queer neighborhoods have changed because of economics, because we're reurbanizing cities again. And that's a bigger issue to think about. But that queer nightlife really highlights in a particular way.
I mean, you kind of mentioned accessibility and transport as well, which are two things that are really important. I mean, there are nights that centre people of colour. I'm thinking particularly about things like Pussy Palace, that you have, great, right? You have a fund that you can put into, whatever you've got that's kind of spare, that is going to get people home safely. So, maybe if it's a bit earlier, that you can get there and it's okay, but getting home is incredibly risky. So it's those kind of like practical things that people are trying to put into effect in order to make sure that everyone has access to these spaces, everyone can get home safely, everyone is kind of being looked out for. But I mean, there is more to be done. More Pussy Palace.
So, precisely on what is to be done. The Mayor of London has pledged to safeguard LGBTQ club culture with a range of measures. These include the appointment of a night czar to champion the city after dark, to an annual audit of LGBTQ venues. My question, I guess, to you two, as people who live in London and frequent London's nightlife and life, do you think enough is being done in London to protect the scene? And then, Ramón, because of the parallels you were drawing with cities like New York and Chicago, do you, I guess I would ask the same question to you about those scenes. And I guess it's about protecting the scene and, how can the scene be protected? What can you do to,
I mean, I think because we're lucky to live in a city of multiple scenes, the mayor needs to think about those multiple scenes and what they need differently. And I think at the moment there are some really positive things that the mayor's done. So I think the Night Czar has been a really good advocate for LGBT spaces, especially having experience of running one of the more progressive, inclusive ones. And I think the mayor is also a brilliant advocate for queer spaces. I think they've come up with this LGBT venues charter, which is a document that's supposed to enable them to work with developers to sort of explain to them what an LGBT space is and why it might be important not to eradicate it. I think that's really positive. Not many of the venues have signed up to it because I think it's quite prescriptive about what a venue is. And they have come up with various other measures to address these issues. So they're having LGBT venues, operators forums, but those only include licensed venue operators. So again, they're missing out on the wider group. So I would like to see that becoming more inclusive. I think also at the moment the London Mayor is, his new plan for London is being examined in public. And my experience of engaging with that is that with some of the activists, Queer Spaces Network and RAISE, we put together a response to the draft London plan, looking at all of the issues around inclusivity in terms of housing, social infrastructure, nightlife, heritage, and we sent a really thoughtful response in the consultation, and we weren't invited to give evidence because the way that the Mayor's addressing inclusivity in that situation is that they're inviting kind of umbrella groups to represent all of the marginalised social groups. So that's meant that our comments haven't been fed into that process, and I do have some very particular things that I would like to see the Mayor enforcing, and they would be making sure that equalities impact assessments are done properly within large-scale developments, because that didn't happen in Crossrail's case, it didn't happen in King's Cross, because LGBT groups, as one of the groups that have protected characteristics under equalities legislation, aren't so visible, whereas if you look at Tottenham Court Road, there was this big attention to protecting the heritage of music spaces, but not to the LGBT spaces. So I'd like to see them enacting the safeguarding measures that are already there effectively.
What do you say, Fenella? Also, I'm interested also because you actually brought up, earlier, when you were talking about getting home safely, you were actually talking about sort of a vernacular solution, if you will, a vernacular underground solution rather than a policy solution.
It's a mixture of both, isn't it?
Absolutely,
and I think that, it's difficult. It's additional labour that you have to do in order to be a bit more informed about policy. So I think that it's all about continuing those relationships outside of the club, engaging with forums or, being aware of what your local council are doing, and just kind of staying as aware as you can and talking to each other and being involved and contributing to those conversations is all that you can really do. It's a kind of a mixture between the two techniques. There's no one singular way to get to this utopic point. That's not the point of Utopia, is it?
So, and from well outside London, and I'm quite interested in learning more about the kind of policy conversation,
right,
how to manage and think about queer nightlife in this particular context, in this kind of affirmative context, as I'm so used to historicizing the prohibition or the obstacles to queer nightlife on the end of policy. In a city like Chicago, for example, where the gay and lesbian kind of mainstream district has been really built up, multi-million-dollar center and retirement homes and whatever, in a fairly stable commercial district. We're also in a context where the kind of financial class upgrade of gay life has meant really further marginalization of queer youth, especially queer color youth, right? So, having upgraded venues does not do away with anti-black racism in a city like Chicago. And so we've seen youth who migrate to queer zones as places of safety for socializing informally, because they're not yet of age, for example, to access the space of the club, are increasingly persecuted not by official city agents, but by neighbors who are really buying into this upper mobile upgrade of gay life, right? And in some ways, a big portion of the effort is with educating, and this is another vernacular solution, but you have to educate these neighborhoods that are coming in based on the attraction of whatever mythology they have about the creative class, about the affluence of gay life and whatever, and saying, if this is going to be queer space, that's a rather different story than it is to be a kind of homonormative, beefed up, commercially viable gay space, right? And we're in a city where we're losing Black life at the minute, incredible levels of violence. And especially for queer youth, it's almost like it's the biggest urgency for me right now to think about, how I cannot glorify another one of those gay clubs or establishments if the kid in the sidewalk, the queer colored kid in the sidewalk, cannot yet find safe harbor, right? So it's a kind of understanding of the great possibilities that that we have been rehearsing here for the kind of work and beauty that unravels in those spaces, but also a really great concern for the kind of access that we create and that we need to continue to sustain.
Ben, I feel you want to add.
Just to add, I think that there is, with the activism that's happened in London recently, there has been a really effective way in which the activists have been moving between the vernacular scale and the policy scale, and I think that's been brilliant. And there are other examples of other cities where LGBT groups are much more embedded into the structure of the city. So Philadelphia is a brilliant example, and in Europe, Gothenburg also has its city council, and they're building a new centre. And then, just to say that there are these new campaigns for new LGBTQI plus centres in London. So I think people are really thinking carefully about how to make those inclusive projects, and I think they're also hopefully thinking about what happened in the past in the London Lesbian and Gay Centre space, where those are difficult things to manage.
Okay, well, just to think about the future, what would you like to see happen in the next 5 years, let's say? As utopian as possible, I guess. Let's think as freely as we can. But also, if we can illuminate the sphere of what's possible, then we can actually go and do it. I don't know who would like to start on such a difficult question.
I spent too long in planning applications to be utopic, so I can't be utopic in a very short time. I would say I would like the City Hall to think more broadly about the infrastructure of queer space in London, from the dance floor to the services and how they can support that infrastructure, which would be the next, taking that work to the next, that they've been doing already, to the next level and being a bit more utopic.
Ramón, Fenella?
I'd probably get, without specifying, because I don't have this, the knowledge of the London scene.
No, but not in London,
really
even in whatever scene you've...
I think, I'm thinking about work of folks like Madison Moore, who did part of his work here in London and in Berlin, but also the work of Karim Kupchandani, who's been working with South Asian transnational queer nightlife and so on. That I wish we drew more of our politics and our policies from these laboratories of queer thinking, right? That I think we have much more to learn about the kinds of tactics and strategies and problem solving and collaborative management of tension and social frictions and amorous, oftentimes less amorous ways, but that there's something about the ethics of queer nightlife and its procedures that may better inform our approach to the more practical realm of policy and politics, right? And I leave it that abstractly, but I really mean it quite concretely, that there's ways in which we rehearse different modes of resolving both and producing both social ties and resolving social rivalries that I wish were more instructive to the frameworks of how we conduct the rest of our business.
Totally.
I mean, I echo your sentiments completely. What I want to see more of is the sorts of attitudes and values that I find in queer nightlife through research and, through on a personal level, compassion, kind of kindness, ways of thinking, of doing things differently, dreaming, and I want to see it infiltrate every aspect of social life, not just in terms of policy that affects nightlife, but I think there are real lessons that can be learned about politics more broadly, how we relate to other people, general tolerance. The world is such a terrifying place that I almost can't breathe sometimes thinking about it, and have to turn off the news because it's going to make me have a huge panic attack about the state of the world. So really, I would like to see those values as concretely embedded throughout all aspects of society, not just queer nightlife. You said dream big.
No, of course. That's what we're doing now. Okay, right. So if that's okay with you, maybe we can open it up, yeah? Okay, so let's open it up to the audience. We have, let me do this properly. Okay, we have 20 minutes, so we can talk about loads of stuff. So any questions, any topics for discussion,
Hello?
more utopias, please bring them on. There are two...
Hello?
Yes.
Sorry, I have a mic.
Oh, right. Hello. Yes, there is.
Sorry, were you doing what the two mics? Sorry. Can I ask my question? Oh, sorry, I thought you were looking.
Sorry, we just can't see you because you
Sorry,
have a
we have a lot of light and I didn't expect you to go get it. Yeah.
Sorry. I just want to say, first of all, thank you all so much for speaking and bringing your perspectives and everything. I'd like to thank you as well, Ramón, personally. For me as a second-generation Latin American, hearing your experience and perspective on this is very validating, heartwarming for me. If you would allow me, I'd like to just offer some context from, it's not necessarily a question, but more context from my position, the work that I do and about the queer nightlife here in London. So I run an event called Maricumbia, I'll be DJing later.
They're about to DJ.
We started off as a party originally just for our friends, but then it turned into something which we actually could create a safe space for QTBPOC because of the lack of space for us in many queer venues. And so we started running this and we were able to then support our community. So we started fundraising for the Latin Village in Seven Sisters. The Mayor of London has signed off for the demolition of the Latin Village. So it's interesting to kind of, it's interesting to think about that, and I think it's very important. And especially placing myself and how I've been running my nights before. I don't have a club or anything, we just had this opportunity with a space and we managed to do something with it. And so, like now we don't really have a space to go. And I didn't even know what the statistics were before, but the fact that there's only like one space that's like a person of color owned space for queer people is like, wow. I don't know. It's just loaded here because I really feel that it's very violent in the UK. There really isn't a safe space for any person of colour, actually, and the people more vulnerable are black and brown people and our trans sisters as well, and siblings. We had Naomi Hersey who died last year, she was killed. There's just so much violence internally and externally that is just not discussed. And there's a problem as well, and it's a cultural problem of Britain. We have a sickness of British drinking culture that seeps so deep. Like literally, like everyone's an alcoholic. Like I'll go out and say it because it is. And the problem with that is that because these spaces are centered around alcohol, and then what do we do then? Because then we're permissive of such reckless and bad behavior that's coming from, like, you know, from all queers really, but I will say like mostly white gay men. And then the straight people that come in and co-opt the space and invade the space and then parade us and then think that we're like, you know, just animals to be touched. Like I've worked in a bar here for for 3 years now, and bare people are just like, you know, it's okay to just like grab, you know. So what I've been trying to put into practice, at least like where I've been working lately, and that's another thing, I don't really get much work now, and like reggaeton, Latino trap is so big that like everyone else is getting work but me. So I've adopted more like, actually I don't give a shit attitude, like you can leave. like in the places that we do have, at least, it's just that thing of like being to the security, it's like, no, this person has to leave. Or like, I just want to be able to like put it out that like adopting more of a like just no tolerance for this shit, because really no one actually does enough. And like I think here we're so permissive and so letting of people, like all the authorities or whatever will sort it out, but no it doesn't. And people don't know their value. We don't know our value here. And as a second generation Latin American, we've only been here for like what, the past 40 decades really. And we come from like huge migration as well, from Pinochet's dictatorship to the drug war in Colombia. And so for us it's so necessary, I'm speaking as a Latinx queer person here, to carve space for ourselves. And also make sure that we create a space that is safe for QEBPOC as well, because it's just not there. And no one's doing enough. That's just all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm really glad. I'm really glad that you're following up what the DJ said.
Yeah.
I think I will call that an intervention, and I thank you for that in advance.
I don't know if we want to say more in response to that, because I think you brought up so many important things about what isn't being done and how things are difficult. And I don't know. I think it's I don't know if we want to have more of that conversation or if we just want to move. You guys decide.
Well, sometimes I think it's important just to listen to people and to listen properly, and I think that's fine. You also make beautifully. I've seen you speak several times before, and it's always really moving. Last time at the RBT when we were commemorating Pulse. And I think you make a really compelling argument for why nightlife does really matter and nightlife is really important, but we do need to think beyond that and think about spaces that, like you say, are not centred around alcohol, that are not centred around hedonism, that these are equally, if not more, vital. And I say that as someone who is incredibly invested in nightlife.
Oh, not all of us drink as well.
Yeah. All right.
I mean, just very quickly to say, I think that you kind of pinpointed the problem, which is it's not just about bars and clubs closing, it's about the form of urbanization that is taking place in advanced capitalist cities. And so if there needs to be a utopia, it's about rethinking better outcomes from those processes, or obstructing those processes, or other ways of resisting those processes, which I think is what lots of the activist groups are doing in powerful ways under difficult conditions. And there are really exciting things coming through, like the Joiners Arms that was closed, forcing Tower Hamlets to re-provide a space and being allowed to rent that at a decent rent, and to redesign new dance floors. So I think there's some optimism for imagining those different futures.
Can we have any more? There's a question. Sorry, I think I have to put my. First of all, there's a question.
Hi, so I actually have a question about capitalism. Is that okay? So as a queer person and activist myself and running queer spaces and working in this environment, something that I've been criticised for in the past is, well, this affiliation with queerness and anti-capitalist mentality has brought about people criticising some of the things that my friends and I have done in terms of activism that incites systemic change within a capitalist system instead of aggressively opposing it in all directions. And I wonder sometimes whether our spaces becoming, again, more underground and more unlicensed and less recordable, is something maybe to do with that, and to do with this ideology that in order to be queer you have to be aggressively anti-capitalist at all times, and whether actually we need to, and I mean I hate to say it, but like work with the capitalist system in order to create these spaces in which we are business owners and we are, you know, creating these spaces in a legitimate and licensed way, and I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Do you mind? I'm happy, you know, I'm not speaking from the UK context. I'm speaking as somebody that comes from one of the biggest recent failures of capitalism, which is being a colony of the United States in the Caribbean, with a debt collapse and no help from your colonial source of such a collapse. And I have to say that there's big risks in talking entrepreneurship in too naive a fashion, and especially because we're suffering through what is a kind of failed effort to do so, right? Especially as a place like San Juan, Puerto Rico was trying to reconfigure so much of its entertainment districts in relation to tourist economies at a time when everything else was being retired through US policy and its governance of the business affairs of the island. And seeing now in my own queer committed mind the possibilities of what has emerged after the devastating hit of the hurricanes in Puerto Rico, and which exacerbated the financial crisis, exacerbated our relationship to, our fractured relationship to the United States and so on. And to see what survived of queer nightlife was not the business model. What survived of queer nightlife were the grounds up community practices, where we're going to open that space when there's no light to light up queer nightlife, where there's no electricity to light up the DJ set, just to gather, to congregate in queer sociality, and to see all these other models of trying to make to at the collapse of capitalism, right? So I'm very suspicious of the kind of possibilities of, but I'm also at the same time all game for playing with whatever is going to resource us going forward, right? As long as we don't do it naively and don't forget that you're signing yourself for some of the trouble we're going through.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it has also come up in these discussions around particular spaces, because in some of the groups have been using legislation that's usually used in quite a conservative way to protect, build heritage, and so some of the more radical reaction to that has been, well, you know, that's not queer futurity, that's actually engaging with a system that's actually part of the problem. But I have come around to the view that we do need to use those mechanisms for the purposes of survival, in the same way that we were talking about the dance floor as a space of survival, at the same time as trying to imagine different ways of, or different kinds of intervention. So, yeah, I don't think I have anything more to say on that, but it's a great question.
I mean, I think I share your position on this, and I think we've actually talked about this before, haven't we? Probably. To share
Do it in public.
I think I'm anxious, I'm very nervous about those kind of strategies. I'm anti-assimilation, but at the same time, I think that sometimes by being very extreme and very radical, you can actually cut off some really important conversations, you can cut off really important contacts that are about a kind of a longer version of change. So there isn't like one singular way of doing things. I think that we can have underground, like spaces, we can have spaces that engage in a more kind of, I don't want to say legitimate, because that's the wrong word, but you understand what I mean. We can do it both ways, as long as it's all kind of moving forwards, because from my perspective, whatever gets us there quick enough, where things are better, then that's fine. I kind of think that at this point, the means could potentially justify the ends.
Okay, thank you very much for that very interesting question. Okay, there's few. There's few. Okay, can we start? Can you see at the back, very back, person second from the center, and then there's one up there, and then there's one up here. But it's good because we have time.
Hi.
Hi.
We've heard about the various reasons for closure of queer venues in London, and there seems to be a particular focus on outside participants. And we haven't necessarily spoken about reasons within the queer/LGBTQ community for why some of these closures might be happening. For example, one thing that springs to my mind is a change in dating practices. So, the infamous Yellow app springs to mind. I imagine gone are the days where a 15 or 16-year-old may go alone to an LGBTQ venue to dip their toe in the water. I should imagine therefore the first port of call would actually potentially be social media or some other avenue. So I'd actually be interested to hear whether in your research any of these kind of points came up, and also kind of on a broader point whether greater inclusivity for LGBTQ people has ultimately led to an erosion of queer venues.
Ben, I feel you should start answering it.
Just quickly, our research goes from the floppy disk to Grindr, so I think it's quite interesting to think about how technologies of communication and sociality have changed during that period. And I don't think at any moment, even now, has there been no requirement for actual queer spaces. And actually it's not like people use one or the other, they use both. And it certainly didn't come up as I think it was one of the things that came up a lot in the media discussion about why spaces were closing, which allowed that media discussion not to really engage with the structural reasons why spaces were closing. And the second bit of your question, I think, yeah, there are a lot more mixed spaces, and one thing that we've done is in our database we've also got spaces that host LGBT nights, as well as spaces that we define primarily as LGBT spaces. But those are also closing because also pubs, nightclubs generally, grassroots music venues, etc. So that's something that the Mayor's Office have been looking at across the board and classifying as cultural and social infrastructure, which I think is a powerful term.
Great, thanks. Do we want to add anything else about this, reasons from within?
I agree with you. I don't think one replaces the other, and actually the more conversations I have with people who are trying to meet and date online or use social media, like, it doesn't fulfill the same functions and it doesn't actually work. It seems to be quite unsuccessful, so there is nothing really to kind of substitute being able to meet people in maybe what we might describe as a more organic kind of way. I don't think it makes it any easier at all. Also, I mean, there were a lot of discussions about kind of whether or not young people are so invested in nightlife as well, which I found quite interesting. And obviously, through like teaching, I talk to my students all the time about, what do you do? Where do you go out? That's a valid question as much as anything about what we've read. But I mean, again, there were a lot of kind of debates that said that, people aren't bothered anymore, they're kind of more anxious about the lives that they're living, they want to kind of be more sensible and not pursue hedonistic pursuits. And again, I think this is actually nonsense. What I'm actually seeing when I go out is that young people are really hungry for these spaces and they really want it. So I think technology, to summarise, shapes things and changes them, but it doesn't replace the physical space itself. And it can be good for maintenance afterwards as well.
I mean, I would second what my panelists have articulated, and also speak, I think this is an area where the kind of synergy social practice between the online, offline, in the context of queer nightlife need to be explored further. One of my dissertation advisees at Northwestern in performance studies has been working on Grindr primarily as a social networking app, and starts one of his chapters of his dissertation talking about communicating in Grindr with one of his interlocutors who's just sitting across the bar, right? And then using that as a jumping off point to talk about the ways in which actually Grindr and other geolocation apps have facilitated some socialization in the space of the bar and the club, and talking especially about the impossibility of sustaining a conversation in those spaces. Not that you go to those spaces always to talk, but as a kind of reintroduction of talk as another mode of communication in a place that has been primarily kinesthetic and gestural and so on. But the fact that, spotting somebody on Grindr and sustaining some other form of communication does not necessarily detract from the economy of nightlife, but might enhance it, right? But no conclusions yet, dissertation in process, but really interesting to think about those aspects as well.
Okay. There was a question here somewhere. Yes? No? Yes. Oh, two. Oh, sorry. Yes. Fine.
Hello. Thank you for your words. It's been really interesting to listen to. Just going back quickly to talking about the queer scene in relation to capitalism. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on I don't know if it's been the same in the US, but at least here in London there's been such a surge recently of sort of H&M and Primark and banks and big companies having pride logos on their clothing and just like massive pride banners in the window sort of almost so quickly. And I found myself becoming torn between feeling so euphoric that finally that's allowed and that's not frowned upon, that these massive corporate companies are if anything, advocating queerness, and between feeling really uncomfortable that it's becoming a kind of consumerable fashion statement sometimes, or maybe it's a relevant question for you, Fenella, but yeah, and I don't know, I sit very on the fence with that, or finding a lot of issues with that, and I don't know how that kind of corporate world can help the queer community without just turning it into a product for capitalism, basically.
Thanks.
Yeah, I can definitely talk about this one. So I completely share your concerns with this, and I think it's a very complex issue in that, how do we kind of really understand a corporation's kind of intentions and in including those representations? Is it just something that's tokenistic? Is it something that's being included because queer bodies are being used as a trend? And I tend to kind of look at various sort of levels of it. I'm really interested in what are you paying people? We're talking here about capitalism, people getting paid money, right, economics. I'm really, really tired of seeing particularly luxury designers profiting off the back of queer people and queer models, not just kind of at a high street level, this happens at all levels of fashion, and then kind of not paying their models, that somehow it's kind of enough payment for you to have been included in this very kind of, I think, superficial way as an image, rather than as someone who might bring something to the table in terms of your actual creativity and your design work. So I think it is difficult. I mean, I'm against it fundamentally. There is some stuff that's really gross, like you'll see companies that have things like Femme Forever on like a t-shirt. I mean, I'm very particular about slogan t-shirts, and I think that, you should be able to read the message without having it spelled out. It's a bit basic. Queer people are very good at communicating through visual languages, and I mean, it's fine for you to do that, but if it's DIY, is essentially my position. So, what was the other one? Working class homo on a £75 t-shirt, or just like, the hell is this? And you know, things as well, like where you have luxury labels who use kind of queer artwork or the visions of kind of queer activists, so images from someone like David Wojnarowicz on something that's extortionately expensive. To me, that's just completely illogical. I was going to say something much worse, but I'm trying to measure myself because my mother's watching the live stream and she'll kill me if I cuss. So, I mean, in answer to your question, I think it's really important that we interrogate kind of what these businesses do. Like, do you employ queer people? Do you pay queer people? You know, really, it's not that hard in this day and age, and it's why I get so angry about it. Because it's not hard to be inclusive, and it's not hard to actually create better representation. Give people a seat at the table. That's literally all that you need to do. Also, diversify your representations. These tend to be like quite thin models, white models, able-bodied. Like, it's not hard to find people, particularly with social media, that you can use. I'm going to stop because I'm ranting now because it's very near and dear. But I think it's complicated, and we just have to kind of look and demand better.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, if you don't mind, I'm just going to take the last 2 questions because there's this person wearing a red t-shirt, please, and then there was someone up there, right? No? Oh, right. Okay, here. No one up there? Yes.
Yes. Try and be quick. You've been talking a lot about homonormativity, and I've been very fascinated, and when I say fascinated, I probably mean dismayed, about how a set of identity self-expressions that saw itself and was being marginalized and othered has moved to the center and now feels itself sort of almost doubly victimized by now being told that they are oppressing other communities and sets of self-expression at the margin. And so my question is, on the one hand, to what extent are they maybe a barrier to a diversification of the scene, but also more positively, how can that power be harnessed? Because outside of the scene, they are very much sort of monolithic, I shouldn't say words I can't pronounce, being seen as the sort of embodiment of the scene. So, and so can that be harnessed in a positive way if we get over the resentment that they might be feeling?
Yeah, I think white folks with money in the EC just need to be able to shut up and listen a little bit, to let other people participate, to not kind of claim their protagonism so much. It's not something that has been given to them, which is the thing. It's something that whiteness with means has claimed for themselves, right? So you know, fighting for LGBT rights in and of themselves without really having a platform that considers racism, class, and other issues is the project that we've had, and this is where we've ended, right? And I think we need to modify what our ethics about gay politics are, and I think a queer ethic starts to introduce and incorporate other axes of difference that are crucial to making these things happen. But I think a lot of responsibility lies on those very folks that have exerted their political and economic power to attain the status that they have gained in society. And they have spearheaded the movement in that particular way to the exclusion of others. And those others now are impatient and knocking at the door and saying, hello, we're here, we've been here. You're wearing our shirts, you're listening to our music, you're dancing to our rhythms, and you're using our choreography now, we want part of this, you know? And not just in this kind of bougie, we want to be wealthy kind of way, but in like, this is what you owe us kind of thing, right? And I think that's so I think a little bit of practicing some gender humility is the way forth, right? And I believe in that. And in that sense, I think that there's nothing negative about that. I think that it's about transforming and being comfortable with being vulnerable and carefully analytical about the power that you wield, even if you come from a historic minority position.
Thanks. Ben, would you like to add something to that?
Just very briefly, because other people might want to ask things, but and just to say that I don't think that is a completely new discussion, and it certainly comes up in the 1980s and 1990s with the London Lesbian and Gay Centre discussion, which a group of activists didn't feel catered for them, and they set up the Black Lesbian and Gay Centre in South London, and there was this discussion around a kind of business gay agenda and a more radical agenda that came from the inheritance of the GLF. So I think that we need to think about these discussions historically and how they've shifted or not, and why they haven't shifted if they haven't.
Okay. Is it okay if I move us along? Okay, well, I'm mortified to not be able to take other questions, but because this now turns into a social space, we can keep chatting. Please join me in...
There was just one thing, sorry, so I'm just going to split this out really quickly. So obviously, there's been quite a few people that have mentioned about capitalism and how queer people interact with this, and especially when that lady mentioned about seeing companies, corporations having queer banners when it comes to Pride Month and that kind of thing. So I definitely think that it's a good thing for corporations to sponsor Pride. But you also have to look at these corporations, because you also said that, do you guys employ queer people? But also, how are we being employed? Are we part of management, senior management? Are we on the board of directors and the advisory committees? Are we part of the decision makers? Are we in positions that are helping steer the company into a more diverse way of practice? And also, the companies that are representing Pride, have they donated their money to causes that go against us? So, for example, I don't want to see, HSBC is sponsoring Pride, but you guys CEOs and people that have donated money to like UKIP, or like conservative policies that don't help queer people, like what the fuck is that?
I think, should we say that those are the last words? Yes, I think so too. Thank you for making them. Okay, so please join me in yet one more applause for our fabulous speakers. And thank you very much for coming, and let also join me in welcoming OP resident DJ of Maricumbia, who will be playing a set, and the deal with the set is that, of course, you're welcome to come and dance on stage. It's a set. It's in the V&A, but it is a DJ set. The only thing I've been told to say is that because there are quite a few of us, please be responsible for your own safety on the dance floor. And yeah, let's try to not overcrowd it, but I'm sure you can self-regulate. Brilliant. Thank you very much, OP.